Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Campbell, and on behalf of Society of Printers, I want to welcome you to our October event, which is Jack Stauffacher's Legacy. The Society of Printers was formed in 1905 by Boston-based designers, typographers, printers, and other proponents of the arts and crafts movement in printing and the book arts. In non-pandemic time, if I could ask people to mute, sorry. In non-pandemic times, we meet privately over dinner on Beacon Hill to enjoy not only each other's company, but also presentations by respected experts and luminaries from the many disciplines of our concern, including literate design, printing history, typography, publishing, and more. In a year marked by isolation, we are opening our meetings to the wider design, typographic, and printing community to offer a vehicle for the sort of connections and discussions that our organization values so much. If you're interested in learning more about the Society or making a donation to support this programming, you can visit our website or contact our governing council at secretary@societyofprinters.org. And tonight we're welcoming Chuck Byrne, a designer and educator whose work is included in the collections of the Cooper Hewitt National Museum of Design and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, among others. He has served as a contributing editor to Print Magazine. He has written for iMagazine and the AIGA Journal and Emigre. His essays have been included in the anthologies Looking Closer and Design Culture, among others. Chuck is currently completing editing and designing for the forthcoming book Only on Saturday, The Wood Type Prints of Jack Stauffacher, which will be published by the Letterform Archive. We're also joined by John Barry, who is an editor and typographer and a contributing writer to Chuck's forthcoming book on Stauffacher. John is a past president of A-Type-I and the former editor of ITC's UNLC magazine. He's the founding director of the Scripta Typographic Institute and has been writing, speaking, and consulting on typography for many years. John is also the author of several books, including Contemporary Newspaper Design, Shaping the News in the Digital Age, and UNLC, Influencing Design and Typography. I'd like to ask that the audience members remain on mute throughout the meeting and enter any questions for the speakers in chat so that they can be answered at the end of the talk. And with that, I'm pleased to hand things over to John Barry, who will be starting things off for us tonight.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you to the Society of Printers for inviting us. I'm just sorry we can't be there in person to do it. I'm assuming that you can hear me correctly, yes?
Loud and clear, yeah.
And let me share screen and then get going. So what I'm using as the text for my talk is basically the article, a biographical essay that I wrote for the book that Chuck is editing. It seemed the logical thing to do. So Jack the Printer, that's how he's known. I start with this photo just because it makes me happy every time I look at it. This is a picture of Jack on the left and his collaborator and friend, Dennis Ledbetter, on the right in Dallas, just after they had set up the exhibit of the VICO collaboration, which I will talk about in a little while. So Jack Stauffacher's career as a printer spanned nearly 8 decades, from his early fascination with the printed word and his experiments on a Kelsey hand press in the 1930s, to his final book, Oxen, Plow, Bicycle, published just a few weeks before his death in 2017. Over all that time, he never fit into any category. As a printer, Jack always felt that he was in service to the word. He described himself, late in life, as arriving at the end of a 500-year tradition of hand-setting type and printing with it, by hand, on a letterpress. What he was too modest to admit was that he was, every inch, a scholar printer in the Renaissance tradition. This is evident in his choice of books to print. Although he must have done job printing sometimes to keep bread on the table, reluctantly and only if he had to, all his important projects had deeper roots, literature and philosophy from the ancient Greeks to the modern French. His books, no matter how finely done, all had a clarity and simplicity that focused on their ultimate purpose, to be read. Jack was no fusty antiquarian. At the same time that he learned the traditions of printing, he was introduced to the creative thinking of 20th century modernism. Jack always worked with the material at hand. He honed and refined his craftsmanship in handling type and paper and ink, and he also played with the possibilities that each of these objects and materials presented. His own experimentation took the form of print. When he started his press as a boy in suburban San Mateo, California, he called it the Greenwood Press, after the street where his family home was located. He continued printing under that name into the second decade of the 21st century. He was also a bicycle polo enthusiast. So I've gone through various parts of his career here, starting with his brother, Frank Stauffacher. Jack credited his introduction to modernism to his older brother, Frank, an experimental filmmaker, who had founded the avant-garde film series Art in Cinema at the San Francisco Museum of Art, now SF MoMA, and was instrumental in the creation of the San Francisco International Film Festival. Frank introduced Jack to the artists and intellectuals who were creating the aesthetic ferment of American and European art and literature at mid-century. In the late 1940s, Jack's printing activities were dominated by work for his brother's project, including the notable 1947 Art in Cinema catalog. Frank's untimely death in 1955 of a brain tumor at the age of 38 left a void in Jack's life. It was through his eyes that I received my baptism into the beauties of this world, Jack wrote much later. Jack met Adrian Wilson when Adrian moved to San Francisco in 1947, after spending the war years in a camp for conscientious objectors in Waldport, Oregon. This is them as young troublemaking printers in San Francisco on the roof of their building. He and Jack shared a passion for printing works that mattered. One of their first works was an edition of Eric Gill's anti-war polemic, and Who Wants Peace? Both of them also had a finely tuned sense of how to arrange words on a page. It's easy to see their common aesthetic sense when you compare their work, both in books and in ephemeral printing. Adrian was more playful, willing to toss in ornament to balance the text. They were both young and willing to try things out. They were also willing to learn from their elders. I always admired and respected him, and he respected me, wrote Jack. But speaking of Adrian, we were part of that generation that started to do fine books under the shadows of the great San Francisco printers like the Grabhorns and Nash and that generation. Adrian and I, and maybe Andy Hoyam, who comes a little bit later, are part of that heritage. Jack hired Adrian to work with him at the Greenwood Press at 509 Stanson Street. They worked together for a year, but as Jack said much later, two strong-willed people were probably better off working separately. And at the end of that time, Adrian left to establish his own press. Our approach to printing is amazingly the same, wrote Adrian at the time, though his critical judgment is entirely intuitive, while mine is pretty intellectual. They remained friends and colleagues for decades, until Adrian's death in 1988. Jack's reverence for typographic tradition led him to his search for the perfect type for books. Not just typeface, but type, the physical pieces of metal that he set by hand and printed with. This search led him to a 17th century book type in the Dutch Baroque style, known at the time as Jansen, after the Amsterdam punch cutter Antoine Jansen. Jack described this type as pure workmanlike letters, communicating effortlessly, exactly what he wanted to do as a printer. He bought a font of Jansen from the German type foundry Die Stempel AG in 1950 and set about not only using it, but studying its provenance and history. He found himself slowly understanding the type's full potential. He also began planning a book about it. While he was working on that project, the discovery of a 1685 type specimen upended the accepted attribution and proved that the Jansen types were actually the work of the Hungarian punch cutter Nicholas Kish, who had worked in Amsterdam before going back to his native Hungary to print Protestant Bibles. Thus, the hybrid favored Kish Jansen. In 1954, Jack published Jansen, a definitive collection, which he called The Summit of My Typographic Knowledge as a Craftsman. But in the same year, he was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to study typographic history in Florence. So he closed the press and moved with his family to Italy. The Fulbright grant was only supposed to be for 1 year, but Jack managed to stretch it to nearly 3 years, from 1955 to 1958. During that time, he visited libraries, paper mills, printers, and famous typographers, as well as bicycling through the Tuscan countryside from day to day, taking black and white photos of the textures of the land and people. Those bicycle trips and his musings on what he saw and found formed the basis of what became his last book, finally published in 2017, Oxen, Plow, Bicycle. In his peregrinations, Jack made a pilgrimage to Verona to meet the master printer Giovanni Marderstag and visit his famed Officina Bodoni. Giovanni's son Martino, who carried on his father's work, became a lifelong friend of Jack's. He journeyed to Basel to meet the German typographer Jan Tschichold, with whom he shared a dual allegiance to both tradition and modernism in printing. Tschichold had been a radical iconoclast in the 1920s, advocating a new typography of the asymmetrical page. But later in life, he reversed course and became a practitioner of the finest traditional book typography. He was an opinionated and forceful writer about design, something that no doubt appealed to Jack. In Venice, attracted by a display of intriguingly printed books, Jack met the editor, publisher, and printer Alberto Tallone, with whom he immediately bonded. Tallone's commitment to literature and fine printing echoed Jack's own. Although Jack met Tallone only that one time, they corresponded thereafter, and Tallone became for Jack both an inspiration and an ideal, as well as a friend. Jack returned to San Francisco in the summer of 1958, but he soon left again to take up a position as assistant professor of typographic design at the Carnegie Institute of Technology, now Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. At Carnegie, Jack established the New Laboratory Press for the purpose of teaching and practicing fine printing. This was a revival of the laboratory press, which had been created in the 1920s by the multi-talented playwright, editor, teacher, and printer Porter Garnett. This is a picture of the original laboratory press with Porter Garnett in the middle, looking at a page. Jack persuaded Carnegie to import an expensive hand-fed Gietz Platen press from Switzerland, with which he revived and carried on Garnett's tradition of hands-on teaching. One of Jack's notable accomplishments while he was at Carnegie was bringing Hermann Zapf to the United States. While Zapf was already well known in his native Germany and throughout Europe as a type designer, Palatino, Optima, and celebrated as a calligrapher, his work was less well known in the US. Jack invited him to teach a 6-week seminar at Carnegie and mounted the first American exhibition of Zapf's work. Before the opening, a local television crew filmed Jack and Zapf on a walkthrough of the exhibit, with both of them gesticulating expressively as they walked, using their hands to trace curves and point out details of serifs, in a performance that Jack described as finger dancing. These are excerpts from the actual film which Jack unearthed, so that you can see why it's not in high quality, but it is an absolutely wonderful artifact. Jack also persuaded the Hunt Botanical Library, which was located at Carnegie, to commission Zapf to produce a special proprietary typeface, cut in metal for hand setting only, just for the library's own publications. He had the support of the library's patron, Rachel McMasters Miller Hunt, herself a master bookbinder and a champion of good printing. The result was one of the last original Foundry types, Hunt Roman. "It was the will of the gods," Jack said later about this unique project. "I could never have planned this." Jack designed for the Pittsburgh Bibliophiles the definitive book, Hunt Roman, The Birth of a Type, about the genesis of its typeface and the process of its creation. This photo is taken at Zapfest in San Francisco in 2001, when Hermann Zapf and Jack Stauffacher reunited for the first time in years. And as you can see, despite its low res, they're really enjoying each other. That is also when Hermann first saw this film, which he didn't even know it existed, much less having seen before. I happened to be in the audience watching his face as he realized what he was looking at. It was priceless. In 1963, Jack left Carnegie to return to California for good. He was hired by State University Press as the typographic director of their book publishing program, which he saw as an opportunity to collaborate with scholars in bridging the gap between author and typographer. At the time, Jack said, Stanford was the last university press where the whole publishing process was still being done under one roof, from design to typesetting to printing to binding. I have no images from his time at Stanford, though it certainly would be wonderful to have some images of the press at the time. He had a rocky tenure at Stanford, where he clashed with the entrenched habits and procedures of how things were done. But he managed to raise the press's design and production standards, and under his direction, the press for the first time began winning awards for book design. In 1966, Jack left Stanford and reestablished the Greenwood Press in San Francisco at a former printer's building, 300 Broadway, in North Beach. When he moved in, he was given a box of assorted 19th century wooden letters. This is what the press looked like, obviously, many years later, his office in the studio. Some of them broken, but nobody needed anymore. These enormous letters and letter fragments, which were too few and too various to be combined into recognizable words, became the raw material of Jack's typographic experimentation over the next 40 years. They are the basis of the prints that are the subject of the book that Chuck has put together for the Letterform Archive. In this period, which Jack later called transformations, he designed books for the Book Club of California, redesigned Landscape magazine, and printed his own books, keepsakes, and ephemera. You can see here in Landscape his typical ragged right text columns, which were very radical at the time. It seemed perfectly normal, and he always got it exactly right. Not all of his work took place in the studio at 300 Broadway. He established a letterpress studio, the Cowell Press, at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and he taught at the Art Institute of San Francisco. He lectured and promoted exhibitions of fine printing. With Chuck Bigelow, he founded the Center for Typographic Language, which offered thoughtful workshops on themes of printing and ideas. He spoke often about the need to integrate tradition and innovation in the design of books. When he was invited by editor Merrill Rolstad to design the new Journal of Typographic Research, which is now Visible Language, Jack's simple but non-traditional interior design, somewhat like the Landscape magazine, with its unjustified right margin, upset readers, and his radical typographic treatment of the cover caused outraged letters. In his response to one of these critics, Jack said that while he was entirely in favor of clarity in text, a cover served a different purpose. His row of large, bold sans serif metal letters, fiercely overlapping across the cover, expressed a spirit of experimentation rooted once more in the materials at hand. Jack loved the work of Albert Camus, and with the cooperation of Camus' widow, he produced the book Albert Camus and the Men of the Stone, a translation of tributes and appreciations of Camus by the printers, typesetters, and others he had worked with at Combat newspaper in Paris. One of Jack's early experiments was a very limited portfolio, 10 copies of typographic meditations on Camus' The Rebel in 1969, juxtaposing huge wooden letters with smaller, expressive handset excerpts from the text. The book for which Jack is most famous is his groundbreaking edition of Plato's Phaedrus, in the translation by Reginald Hackforth. It is both a classic example of fine printing of a renowned work of ancient Greek literature and a radical rethinking of how to present such philosophical dialogue. The project evolved over several years in the mid-1970s, years of study and experimentation and finally of printing, one form at a time with carefully hand-set type. The radical yet very natural solution to arranging the two voices of the dialogue on facing pages grew out of many experiments and much trial and error. Jack carried on an extensive correspondence about the project with his former student, Chuck Bigelow, both of them analyzing and thinking about the right form for such a book. Another former student, Jim Ferris, used a grant from the NEA Master Craftsman Apprenticeship Program to collaborate with Jack, hand-setting the book and printing it on the 5th. Like so many of Jack's most characteristic endeavors, the Phaedrus earned both great praise and great resistance from reviewers when it was published. Jack became a consultant to the digital firm AUTOLOGIC in 1984 and to Adobe Systems in 1986. In 1987, Sumner Stone, who had worked at AUTOLOGIC and was now director of typography at Adobe, brought a Macintosh computer to Jack's studio and gave him copies of the early Adobe Originals fonts. "I learned to develop computer skills," Jack said. Jack's typographic vision gave the printed type specimens for the Adobe Originals their distinctive look and feel. He particularly designed the text showings, beginning with the specimen book for Adobe Garament, showing how each typeface worked in action. Jack later worked with Stone's own series of size-specific digital typefaces, cycles, in a back-and-forth collaborative iteration through several book projects. He also designed a complexly striking poster for the debut of the ITC Bodoni type family, which Stone had been involved in developing. I have the framed copy of this that used to hang in the ITC offices, and there's no good way to photograph something that's framed with glass, but you can see how complex it was. One of the most visible fruits of Jack's experiments with his box folders is a series of collaborations with photographer Dennis Ledbetter, based on the 18th century philosophical text of Neapolitan scholar Jean-Baptiste Vico. Jack had been fascinated by Vico for many years. In one early experiment, Open Letter 1, 1973, he had used quotations from Vico in conjunction with the wooden letters to experiment with meaning and shape on the page. Vico's original edition had been published in a tiny format, set in the equivalent of 7-point type. Both the text and the format fascinated Jack and challenged him. He even set a paragraph of the text in 7-point type and tied it up in a block to find out how it felt to work with type that small. Jack and Dennis had previously collaborated on The Beams of Montaigne's Library and This Book as an Object, and some smaller publications as well. Jim Ferris describes their work together over nearly 30 years as probably the longest continuing collaborative partnership Jack ever had in his career. The first of 2 Vico portfolios juxtaposing Dennis's photographs with Jack's prints, those are Dennis's photographs of the type, was published in 2003, the second in 2006. Each was accompanied by an exhibition at the Bonifant Gallery in North Beach. The second was commemorated with a small book, the Vico Collaboration, giving context as well as serving as an exhibition catalog. The Vico collaborations were also exhibited at Stanford University's Green Library in 2007. Jack's second ambitious book from the Greek and Roman classics was published in 1992, Odes Horace, along with a companion volume about the project, The Continuity of Horace. This had been a 12-year journey, beginning in 1980 while working with Michael Taylor on a new translation of the first book of Horace's Odes. Taylor's use of varying indents and line lengths and Jack's placement of the type on the page from poem to poem created a unique typographic treatment of Horace's text. Jack's work, especially his experimental work, was introduced to a new generation of designers with the article that Chuck Byrne wrote for Emigre magazine in 1998. Emigre, founded by Rudy Vanderlans and Susanna Lichko, had been the voice of an unfettered, untraditional approach to typography during the digital revolution of the 1980s and early 1990s. Bringing the work of a letterpress printer to the attention of young digital designers was a remarkable bridging of generations as well as technologies. It raised awareness of Jack and his work in the general world of graphic design, recognition that was formalized when Jack was made an AIGA medalist by the American Institute of Graphic Arts in 2004. The article also led to an exhibition of Jack's prints at the San Jose State University in 1989, which Chuck Byrne said was the largest exhibit of Jack's work and brought more Bay Area recognition for Jack. In 1999, near the turn of the millennium, the Book Club of California published A Typographic Journey, the definitive history and bibliography of the Greenwood Press to that date. Jack wrote, compiled, organized, and designed the book, interspersing his own commentary with a wealth of quotations and reminiscences from others, illustrated with photographs and reproductions of his work, as well as a handful of bound-in inserts of actual letterpress pages. When Jack's entire career could be considered a conversation, engaging his curiosity and exploration of ideas and the craft that embodied them. His conversations were quite literal, too. At a very local level, which nonetheless reached sometimes around the world, for many years, Jack hosted a weekly lunch gathering in North Beach, at which creative artists, printers, filmmakers, writers, photographers, playwrights, and others would come together at a long table over an informal lunch and share their work and their ideas. It could accurately be called a salon, although Jack avoided the word. To him, it would have sounded pretentious. It was not the first or only time Jack created an opportunity for ongoing conversation like this, but in the first decade and a half of the 21st century. His Friday lunches, though modest though they seemed, were one of the cultural nodes of San Francisco. When Jack turned 90 in 2010, the anniversary was recognized with a large, well-attended event hosted by the San Francisco Center for the Book. This session brought together dozens of the people who had been influenced by or befriended by Jack over the course of his career, including the whole range of the printing and typographic communities in San Francisco and California. Naturally, it resulted in a printed keepsake produced on the spot. Many of the attendees brought printed, drawn, and in one case hand-carved mementos of Jack's creative life. As Jack said in his brief remarks at the event, "I'm a great believer in asking deep questions of everybody, because I want to find out, or I read a book that has piqued my attention, be it bicycles, be it Plato, be it Horace. And my friends always bring on the table things to talk about and enrich the conversation. So let's, tonight, enrich the conversation here among friends." Jack never stopped working, thinking, talking, and creating, though his energy flagged in his final years. Jack Stauffacher's last book was published with Dennis Ledbetter's help in the fall of 2017, Oxen, Plow, Bicycle, Fragments from a Tuscan Diary, 1956-1958. Its careful arrangement of photographs from the countryside around Florence and small bits of prose from his observations at the time, typeset digitally but printed in a handsome format on creamy Mohawk superfine paper, is a fitting culmination of both the modesty and the achievement of Jack Stauffacher, printer. I'm ending with this photo of Jack, despite its low resolution, because I absolutely love the way it shows his explaining things and teaching things and talking. He's talking to students and others at an AIGA conference, as I recall. It's just, that's Jack in a nutshell. Now let's hear from Chuck.
These wooden letters were in my possession when I first got here, because I went downstairs in the building, the 300 Broadway, and was given these box of letters. And out of that, in my own free time, I would just work with them and experiment just for my own pleasure. So it was a process of doing and making mistakes. Also, my interest in the works of Braque and his innovative cubist work. I relate the violin and the pipe as an epitome of that kind of a way of looking at a painting so differently than we normally would. I was sort of, in one sense, conservative. I'm still conservative. But I like to move the edges out a little bit, try to kind of shape them into a harmonious whole. Let's put this close like that. What you see here, all this different, marvelous, the letters are no longer an S, it's something else. It's becoming something else. Well, I put this H there. And then when you print them, that patine, they're not all perfect, they're imperfect. They got scratches, they got like they've been really used. And so they radiate its own life. And is pleasantly connected with another letter that's also had a life. And each one has its own identity, yet they can all become integrated in one image. So that's, I mean, they smell good, they look good, they have a heartbeat. They're not just dead wooden letters. They are waiting to be used again with people who have passion.
Okay, we're primarily going to be looking at the book that is in preparation right now, and comment on Jack's work as we move through the different slides for this. What you're looking at is me looking at the first time there was a complete mock-up of the book when we were shooting the Kickstarter video for collecting money to print the book. Here's that a little clearer. That is the dust jacket for the book. And that's one of Jack's prints that was used extensively in a piece we'll look at called On Hand. This is the cover of the book, Only on Saturday, the wood type prints of Jack Stauffacher. Cover has been done for a long time. I wish the book has been done for a long time. But it's interesting that what you are looking at on that cover was one of the very, very last experimental prints that Jack did. These are two premium pieces that I forget what they cost to do, but the book is down below. This is a slipcase. This is a folder with 10 reproductions of Jack's work. And then on the other side of the folder, it will be 8 or 10 proofs of letters from Jack's collection that he has used, and which are going to be done over at Peter Koch's shop. John mentioned the PHAEDRUS, and that's a good recognizable place to start to see the pages. The book is 10 by 14 inches and is a big book. Jack would be very upset because he did not like large books. But this is typical of the first part of the book, which consists of general essays written by about 5 people: Jim Ferris, Dennis, and Pino, and Pino Tojo, and several others that deal with Jack in a general way. As part of the general essay portion, there is, as John mentioned, fascination with Friday lunch and its long history and the people that attended. And it just presented an opportunity to put in lots of pictures, but also seemed a safe way not to have to find out the name of each one of these people. So we just put them in as a grid. This is a page that my essay is in and shows another kind of relationship. The captions for this book are generally at the top of the page, not all the time. Are a topic of conversation about how they're done, let's say. In this spread, what we're looking at is we would be near a point in the text where discussion of Jack and his Vandercook printing press would be important. And we were lucky to find a contact sheet of Dennis's photography that had Jack doing a demonstration of inking up and printing with the Vandercook press. This is one of the first experimental projects Jack undertook. This was done in the late 60s, mid-late 60s at Carnegie. And I'm betting that it was done on the New Geats press. There are some discussions of what might have been done on Vandercook, but I don't think you do this sort of thing on a Vandercook, and he didn't have one at that time. These are a series of studies. All of these are at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and were, along with other things, collected years and years ago. SF MoMA was the first really active institutional collector of Jack's experimental works. But his books and some other broadsides and portfolios are certainly collected by rare books and general libraries. This corner piece, these are all 10 by 10 inches, proved to occupy a great deal of Jack's future life and started him off defending, having to defend what was basically experimental work. This is the cover of the Journal of Typographic Research. I don't know which volume this is. It might be, no, it's not. This started in the late 70s, and Jack designed the cover, used this experiment over here that wrapped around the book and caused a lot of trouble. And Jack has reproduced, and other people have reproduced some of the letters to the editor of the Journal of Typographic Research about this smear of type. And Jack wrote a delightful response, having just so much fun. It always reminded me of someone like Errol Flynn having a sword fight and just cutting the other guy up with great aplomb. There were, and I don't have any of them here, but there was a very large, I think it's about 4 or 5 foot long photostat of this in Jack's studio all the times I had been there. Now, this is a little bit important too, because this was my second introduction to Jack Stauffacher. The first one was a book you probably know called Typo Mundus 2. Proved to be a very important book, and he had some work in there, and I became very interested in what turned out to be his life's dream, which is bringing together modern typography with traditional typography. And I can tell you that when this cover arrived, I looked at it and I thought that, okay, somebody knows how to do that. You might recognize a person in here. This is an essay about Jack's first, what we call portfolio, by Chuck Bigelow. And Chuck had been a student of Jack's and then a teaching assistant with Jack at the art school in San Francisco. And this shot in the up middle top is a shot of Jack and Chuck Bigelow looking at a new digital equipment computer, which Chuck tells me was what he used to design the that first, I guess, Microsoft used it, Lucida typeface. And the reason they're looking at it together is that Chuck had opened an office in the 300 Broadway building where Jack's office was. This is actually the gallery shot here. This is an SF MoMA exhibit with the portfolio of the rebel Albert Camus 25 typographic meditations. It was the first time it was shown this big art collect together. Down below or another exhibit at SF MoMA with work in. This is Camus made up of spreads. And from a formal point of view, the important thing here is how Jack treats this page spread. There's nothing great, too radical about these pages. He's still trying to relate the metal type on the left with the big wood type on the right. An early use of the wood type. Here's on the right are the spreads bigger. Now this portfolio, the wood type pages, has been shown a lot, and it's unfortunate that it's not shown with as a spread, but as a individual print. But what was the one and only copy, which SF MoMA procured, it turns out there were portions of one or two other portfolios which could be put together to make another copy of it. We're talking about a book produced by the Letterform Archive, and part of the Letterform Archive's charge and responsibility they've taken on is collecting work that would be considered not finished work or incidental work. And so there are lots of, the institutions collected a lot of material that are proofs or run-up sheets. And what we do in this book, whenever possible, and we can find them in the collection, we like to put some of those proofs opposite the final version of the thing. And these type of things are very popular, from what I understand, with younger designers and typographers. Then as we go through the book, you'll see these two-page spreads, one with a big object and the other with a caption. And all of this work has been photographed at super high resolution at the Letterform Archive and also by 42 line. And I can tell you, if you get one of those high resolution files, which are as big as a barn door, and get it to open in your copy of Photoshop and start looking at the detail in it, you can actually see the fiber of a thicker piece of paper. It's amazing. This is a spread about Jack's first, what we think of, formal portfolio. It's wooden letters from 300 Broadway. And there's no real particular philosophical theme involved in this portfolio. It was just coming up with what we call a central figure and how it relates to the space of the page. There's nothing extravagant about how the space is organized. And Jack referred to these things as totems. And they really, once you hear that, you look at them and you can't think of them as in any other way than they're totem-like. This is the series of prints that are in this portfolio. This was the first one. It sold out. It was at the Bonifant Gallery and sold out, I think, before the end of the exhibit. Now, this is an example of we make a selection of a few larger things to show, to get a better idea at scale what they're about. And here again, you see on the left some material that was found in just piles of paper that came out of Jack's studio, where he had fiddled around and was attempting to get something going with these particular letters. This is an early example of using the letters. This was done with Jack and Michael Taylor, who did translations for Jack. And it's interesting way it's done. And it's one of the reasons that we selected an image from this book for the dust cover of the jacket. Here the thing is, and it's seemingly complicated, but in reality, it's not. The top row shows just a few pieces of paper that are printed back and front, and then folded in and put in the various signatures such a way that half appear in once of a single sheet appear in one side of a spread, and then somewhere else in the book the other side will appear. This there's no big attempt to accomplish much in terms of the relationship of the metal type to the wood type. We saw this. Later, starting at about 1990, or before 1990, Jack got involved with some of his best known work that had to do with exploring the possibilities of wood type on the Vandercook proofing press. And it's interesting business, and a lot of people get very upset when they see this, and Jack would just almost screech in joy when they got upset, because they would be fine printers and they get upset because there's solvent draining on the piece of paper. And he thought it was fine that they got upset, because they were really thinking about what all these wonderful letterpress tools were about. In that same approach, which had several years of experimentation, these 4 pieces, which are owned by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and were an important part of this show about Jack, and other material that are in the collection there, were discovered in a storage facility Jack had, and were just 4 sheets of M with 4 different approaches to how you might print that piece of wood type. Jack had no idea why he did it. No amount of torture would offer an idea of what it was about. Then finally we decided that it must have been done for some kind of demonstration. Now, these 4, which are referred to as the 4 M's, have a really commanding presence when they're shown together. And it's serious. They're serious pieces. They're serious prints, but at the same time, really compelling and fascinating. I don't know how we get that again. Sorry, there's a little shift here. This is another totem from Wooden Letters from 300 Broadway. The next portfolio we'll briefly talk about is the VICO collaboration. I won't attempt to explain it, but it's within a single box. There are actually two folders of prints. One of them wooden letters, the other's photographs. Jack did the wooden letter prints. Dennis Ledbetter did the photographic prints in the companion piece. Here are the seven prints in the portfolio. And not to get in it too far, these are very different in a way because Jack is at the point where he starts really attacking the space of the sheet of paper and is deeply involved in work that's common in fine arts, which is making shapes that work with the edges and animate the entire space of the piece of paper. This is also a big tribute to the philosopher Vico, who Jack was a big fan of. And if you understand anything about Vico, and I only know a little bit of it, it all makes sense because it has to do with looking at objects produced in a certain context and understanding that that context can change due to several kinds of reasons. And Jack spent a lot of time talking about this in a conversation, public conversation I had with him at Los Angeles County Museum of Art when the show opened. And there were people in the audience who kept asking, well, how does this, how did these letters relate to the little quotations like head of top feels more thirsty that were from Vico? I can't figure out what the relationship is. And Jack would say, don't think of them as letters. Think of them as shapes and spaces. They're something different because the context in which they're placed is different. And it turns out that's a major component of how Jack thought about these things. As you saw in the video, where he points constantly to the space around the letters and the counters of the letters and how different spaces are constructed as you move the type around. He then, in answering the young woman's question about what does it mean, Jack asked her, what did you conclude? And she concluded something about saving bees in the world. And he sort of laughed and said, that's perfect. That's it. That's what it means right now to you. Again, there's a study on the left for the piece on the right. This is a series of prints done by Dennis in address particular topics in VICO and the relationship to the various editions of VICO. Here's a spread with just a single photograph. This I put in the middle of here because it has interesting content about how Jack worked. This is a commission for San Francisco Museum of Modern Art on the 75th or something like that anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge. And the museum commissioned, a group within the museum commissioned Jack to do a print on the bridge. And he actually struggled with it a lot, but in the end came up with something pretty fine as far as I'm concerned. In the upper left-hand first photograph on the left, you can see, if you look at the sheet that Jack is holding up, it looks like some things are attached to the surface of the thing. And this is typical Stauffacher way of dealing with things. He would proof on the Vandercook a collection of letters he thought might be interesting with a particular subject. He'd run off a proof of these, just filling up the page, and then he would start cutting the letters apart and arranging the letters on a sheet that was the size that he intended to work with. So you would see a lot of these over the years floating around, but it ended up for him to be a productive way to move ahead with things. Now, it doesn't mean that nothing was done on press about relationships or whatever. There was a lot of adjusting that went on with the thing. On the photograph on the right is Jennifer Fletcher, who's curator of architecture and design, who Jack was working with, and they're discussing at length what's the right color for this. And here's Jack putting together type in the Vandercook proofing press, and here he is actually pulling a final print. And here he's looking at it, and the young lady is an apprentice that spent several years with Jack. And here's Jack with one of the first completed prints. On the left, you can see the range of ideas that Jack tossed around before getting down to business. Here. On the right is the print, and on the left is somebody looked at it and said, well, only a designer would be interested in this. And yes, I was fascinated with these relics that the archive had collected as Jack was fiddling around with ways to deal with the patch of copy that was at the bottom of the B. That was a commission print. This was a limited edition print and was just a print. The other things like the running solvent down the Big 5 and A and those things are actually monoprints, whereas the work changed and Jack changed a particular configuration of type, they would be completely individual using the same pieces. That would be mono, a single print from there. The archives, several times, I think before Jack died and after Jack died, made arrangements to secure piles and piles of piles in the studio. You could hardly move through it. And this material was brought back to the letterform archives, and well after the book was started, I got a call, and Dennis Ledbetter and I went over to look at some stuff that the people at the archive were saying they had not seen of Jack's work, but had just sort of come out of the piles. And we started looking at them, and it turns out that this was a collection of materials going back possibly 40 years, more likely 30 years, where Jack would do something and just set it aside, and then maybe pick it up later, or do lots of them and then select just a few. And he did a few of things where they're just small variations of an object. In this case, it was a broken C, a piece of type he had, and how these were, he was using them in a way to see how can those things control the two-dimensional space. Here's some more material. Now, the prints on the left are from what we're referring to as transparency series. The layers of ink that are put on in some cases are meant to be, have a depth to them. In other cases, he doesn't want you to have any depth. He wants it, he's working on the shapes on the surface. There had been a few of these had shown up and were known about. And Jack had a favorite thing with me. I'd walk in and he'd say, oh, look at this, look at this. And he'd go over and grab something off a pile and show me something that I had never seen before and quite possibly no one else had. Well, a few of these were available and were sold as one only. And the one on the left, I believe, is in the collection in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. The one on the right was found after the material went to the archive, and obviously has something to do all the way back to when he was interested in wiping the wood type on the Vandercook proofing press with different amounts of solvent on a rag and going in different directions. More and more groups of prints spread out over a long period of looking at stacks and stacks of work. You start to see things that are very consistent, and they were discovered individually, but once you get them together and find them and get them together, you start to see that these were a series that had regular work done on it. But it was not doing all this in 1 or 2 Saturdays. These things could span over possibly decades in having work done on them. The results are pretty interesting. They're not all heavy and dark. We did several light ones. And again, these would appear, this one's signed and he knew it and had it out. And then with just a little bit of work, you start to discover the companion pieces to the theoretically finished print on the right. This was only discovered by me when lots of work was at the archive being having photographs taken. And I had never seen this before. No one else I know had seen it before. And at first it sort of put me off because it was un-Jack-like and that it was dark. But the more and more I look at it, I think it's one of his finest prints. There is some serious consideration about how to make this thing work, the space to work, and then typical of Jack, working with letterpress techniques, both approved and those that are not approved, with the same pieces of type rotated, with the paper rotated at different positions and then imprinted again, and then the sequence in which ink is applied to the thing. We have no idea what the date is this, and I'm thinking that it might have been on newsprint, which would be sad. Now, along the line of discovering these things, we've come up with a small collection of work that we're just referring to as Make Ready. And it was Jack taking what I call run-up sheets from the past, some of them going back 30 years, and then putting wood type on top of them. Now, not doing it all at one time. If you really get into this, you can break the code down, and you can see, like on number 2 here, this part, the big O, I think is from wooden letters, is VICO collaboration. And then the Y and the A and the U are from another print. I can't remember what it's all about. Now, this is done on a sheet that was used in producing a broadside or something like that, a page from a book, sheet from a book. And he was quite fond of putting these things together on this particular sheet here, which is a piece that was celebrating the 75th, I think, anniversary of the Charter of the United Nations. And the thing that Jack found interesting about this was that the charter, which was written in San Francisco, was printed at 300 Broadway, in a print shop at 300 Broadway. And he thought that this made absolute sense, that this should all go together. Here we're looking at a make-ready sheet. The right side of the spread I consider obviously the most important print, but the back side has an interesting one. And the small image on the left is the back side of this sheet. And this I own and was given to me by Jack one day. He thought I was crazy for liking stuff like this. And I walked in one day before lunch to pick him up. And he said, wait a minute, wait a minute. And he came running over. And typically he held up the print, pushed it in my face. And he says, what do you think of that, huh? And I was blown away by it. And he said, that's for you. And so he gave it to me because I like that stuff. But I showed it at a very early meeting at the Letterform Archives. And Rob Saunders was sitting there at the table and just looked at it and said, that's the cover. So that ended up being the cover. That ends my soliloquy on the thing. This is my favorite photograph of Jack with me, and it was the morning before the opening of the Wooden Letters from 300 Broadway, the first portfolio, and the first time I believe Jack saw that all up on the wall of a gallery. And he was just in seventh heaven. I don't think I've ever seen him happier. And his dentist took this picture decided to take on this sort of pixie attitude about it all and was dancing around the gallery, and as I sort of look on in disgust. Just the sales pitch here. It's still possible, although the money for doing the book was raised through a Kickstarter fund that was successful, very successful. It's still possible to get the book by ordering it from IDGoGo, which I don't know much about, but at the bottom is the link. The last line of this slide is the link to get to where the trade edition of the book and the special editions and a couple of other things they made in conjunction with Jack's work are available. Thank you very much. I hope it didn't bore you.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Chuck, and thanks, John, for everything you shared.